So this is how Russell Shorto once described himself. Picture me, if you will, as I settle at my desk to begin my workday. Feel free to use a Vermeer image as your template. The pale yellow light that gives Dutch paintings their special glow suffuses the room. The interior is simple, with high walls and beams across the ceiling. The view through the windows of the 17th century house in which I have my apartment is of similarly gabled buildings lining the other side of one of Amsterdam's oldest canals. Only instead of a plump maid or a soldier at the center of the canvas, you should substitute a sleek, rumpled writer squinting at his laptop. I know it's cliche to say that I couldn't dare come close to describing the writer better than himself, but in that case, I wholeheartedly give over to cliche. Russell Shorto's writing, whether in his books or his articles for the New York Times Magazine, truly jumps off the page. And to say his word choice paints a picture is not giving it its due. Born in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, Shorto is a writer of narrative history. His books include The Island at the Center of the World, Amsterdam, A History of the World's Most Liberal City, and the book we're here to discuss tonight, Revolution Song, A Story of American Freedom. His books have been translated into 14 languages and won numerous awards. He's a senior scholar at the New Netherland Institute and a father to 6 children, which I pointed out to him mirror the number of characters in this book. Please welcome Russell Shorto.
Thank you, Courtney, for your generous words. And I feel the need to point out I have 3 children and 3 stepchildren, so it's a little, 6 children, people say, wow. And thank you, Sue Woody, and thank you, Dory and Aaron and everybody at the Des Moines Public Library. Thank you, Harry and Pam Woody, for who I met last night. And I'm going to let them stand in for all the sponsors of this AViD series, since they're the only ones who I've met. But thank you to all the sponsors, and thank you all for being here to support books. People care about books, and it always amazes me and delights me that people will leave the comfort of their home and travel out into, well, this is a pretty beautiful evening, to hear someone talk about a book. So it gives you hope. So I'm very happy to be here. I will begin with a confession that I'm not an authority on the American Revolution. And I didn't set out to write a book about the American Revolution. I came at it from the other side. I was one of those people that in high school, when you had to study that period of history, it just was flat for me, and I will blame it on the teachers who aren't here to defend themselves. But it just didn't work for me. But then, as Courtney alluded to, my real area of expertise is in the world of the 1600s, the century or more before the period of the Revolution, and in particular, what was then called the Dutch Republic, because in the Netherlands, and other parts of Europe as well, but really starting there, in the early part of the 1600s, and this is what I always go back to, it's kind of the core thing that fascinates me, people began looking in microscopes and telescopes and seeing things that contradicted what they had been told about the way the world was, the way the universe was. And eventually, they started to draw conclusions about this. And the philosopher René Descartes is considered the father of modern philosophy, because he was the one that tried to pull all this together and come up with what this meant. He came up with a new theory of knowledge that said knowledge doesn't just come from what we've been told by the church or by the king or whoever. Knowledge comes by way of this thing called reason. We each have inside us this mysterious thing that connects somehow to the universe, so that we can begin to understand it. So from the 1620s and 1630s, when people started to have these notions, they began to make inferences. They began to say, well, if that's the case, if everybody possesses reason in more or less the same amount, doesn't that mean that this, in the 1640s, people were saying, doesn't that mean that girls have just as much right to education as boys? And people started to say, doesn't that mean that the only form of government that's legitimate is one in which every individual has an equal say? So what fascinated me was that there were all these little movements, little kind of utopian communities forming and things like that around these ideas, around the idea of individual freedom, the primacy of the individual, because we all have this thing called reason. But it didn't really take hold. You know, big changes tend to require a certain amount of momentum before they get going. So after I'd written a couple of books set in that world of the 1600s, and I think in the back of my mind, I was kind of letting that notion, this wave, this building wave toward individual freedom, roll forward in my mind. And then when you come at the 1750s and 1760s and 1770s in America, you can see the leaders of what became the American Revolution taking that wave and saying, we're going to channel it. We're going to focus that beam onto this notion of political freedom. And so they used it in a specific way. But what I was really interested in was this broader notion of freedom that was building and that continued to build right through the American Revolution, and really the whole history of the country has to do with the continuing evolution of that notion. So that's where I came at this topic from. And I thought, I started by thinking, and this was years ago, what if you wrote a book about that period that did not so much look at it in terms of battles or in terms of the political leaders and the great documents that they constructed, but individuals, because that's what it's all about. And what if you were able to construct a narrative from the lives of a handful of individuals from very different backgrounds? Because we still tend to look at that period from the perspective of the men in the powdered wigs, you know. So I had that idea, and I quickly ran into some problems because I write nonfiction. I require material to work from. And as it turns out, those men in the powdered wigs tended to have lives that are very well documented. They wrote lots of letters, and they're well preserved. But other kinds of people, for the most part, we don't have full documentation of their lives. So I didn't know if this would work. But over time, over about a 2-year period, I sort of auditioned people for roles in the book. And I probably auditioned somewhere between 100 and 150 people. I wanted people from different backgrounds, because that was the whole point. I wanted, the lives had to be well documented. I had to be moved by them, you know, because I really believe as a writer, if you are energized by a book, that definitely means that that writer was energized in writing it. And there are a lot of writers who I think while they're writing a book because they have a contract or whatever reason, but they're not into it. And you can tell very quickly. So I had to be, you know, I had to have to be excited by these people. And this was maybe the extra level of difficulty, I write narrative history, which is storytelling. I think history is properly storytelling. It's what the ancient Greeks did. It was what Herodotus did. The first histories were really, I'm going to tell a story so that we can understand the past, so we can understand ourselves better. So I care a lot about the reading experience. And I didn't want to write something that would be 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 different sections that weren't related to each other. So I wanted to find people whose lives intersected, overlapped, something so that as you're reading it, you feel it pulling together as one story, even though they're from very different places. So after about 2 years, I came up with 6 people. And I had, by that time, 6 great piles of material, research material on these people. And then I decided, okay, I think this is worth doing. I still don't know if it would work, but because it's a very, to me, I'd never worked like that before. So what I came up with then, and if you have not read the book but are interested to, it's, I guess, a warning that it's not a traditional account of the American Revolution, but I was gratified, and I kind of understood when Gordon Wood, who's one of probably the premier scholar of the American Revolution, said about the book that it was a surprisingly complete account of the period. And I understood why he said surprising, because what I wanted to do is tell the story of these people's lives. What did it feel like to live through that period? And then in between, you would get the sense of the Battle of Yorktown and Saratoga, and you would get all the main points would be hit. So what I'm going to do is take you through each of these 6 lives. And before I do, I will tell you that at some point when I was in the middle of working on this, I was very aware that these different lives were being kind of processed or mediated through one consciousness, mine. And I really wanted to see what they looked like visually processed through one consciousness. So I wanted to find an artist who would make portraits of each of the 6 of them. And as it happens, my sister is an artist. Her name is Gina Dominique. She teaches art at City University of New York. And I didn't think of her at first because she really does very conceptual art that has all this kind of Hindu influences and things like that. But she, in fact, teaches portraiture, so she obliged me. So what I'm going to do is, one at a time, I'm going to give you the portraits that she did, so you'll have some visual reference. So this is the first one. And right away you will see, I said I wasn't going to focus on the men in the powdered wigs, and what do I give you? One of the men in the powdered wigs. But the men in the powdered wigs are an important part of the story. I don't mean that to not include them, but I wanted to give a broad sense of the period. And of these 6 portraits, by the way, 4 of them are done from life, from portraits that were painted in their lifetime, and 2 of them we don't know. We don't have a picture, so those she invented using, and I'll point those out. So this one was done from life, and he is the first of the 6 who I just fell in love with, and I said, I've got to have him. He's kind of a lovable villain to me. He is a British aristocrat who was born George Sackville, and later he became Lord George Germain. To me, he represented everything the Americans were fighting against, and he represented it with great gusto. He really believed in it. He was a very wealthy aristocratic from a very ancient family, and to give you an idea of his life, he was raised in a house in the southeast of England, which is called Knowle, Knole, and it still exists. You can visit it. And it was built as part of a fad among the very wealthy in England at the time. It was called a calendar house. So there were 12 separate entrances, one for each month of the year. There were 52 interior staircases, one for each week. And there were 365 rooms. He was a teenager before he could wander through the house without getting lost. So he had this very privileged upbringing. His father was a diplomat, and when George was young, and George was a very combative, aggressive personality from the get-go. His father was a very mild-mannered man who was a diplomat, and he was sent to be the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, because the American colonies were sort of protectorates of England, and so was Ireland. And it was administered in a different way, and they had what this officer called a Lord Lieutenant who oversaw it for England. So his father is sent there, and George goes to Trinity College, and when he in Dublin, and when he gets out, he becomes his father's secretary, and he watches his father dealing with the feisty Irish in this very meek manner, as he thinks, and watches the Irish kind of running circles around him. And he very quickly determines this is no way to run an empire. You have to use proper force. From there, he joins the army. He has all this ambition. He becomes an officer. He distinguishes himself in battles, and because he's so highborn, people start thinking he's going to be prime minister one day. Then, this is in the 7 Years' War, which in this country was the French and Indian War, but the 7 Years' War between France and England was played out in many places, including in Europe. And so in the 7 Years' War, in 1759, there's a battle at a place called Minden, and which is in Germany, and he is the second in command. He's in charge of the cavalry, and he's supposed to, when he gets the signal, rush in. And the rider comes up, gives him the message, charge, and he doesn't charge. And the second rider comes up and says, charge, and he doesn't charge. The third time he charges. But, and the English won the battle, but it was felt that had he charged the first time, the victory would have been so decisive, it would have forced the French to surrender, and the whole war would have ended years earlier. His name became mud. He became the most hated man in England for this. So he's court-martialed, he's tried, he's almost executed for treason. He then falls completely from grace, but he is inexorable. This is in 1759, and so from then he begins clawing his way back into favor and back up the rungs of power, so that in 1772 they say, all right, we'll give him the role of Undersecretary of State for the American colonies. So whatever happens in America, he's in charge. So there he is, right when the Americans decide that they're going to declare independence. So he becomes the man who's running the war for England. And I was fascinated by that, and by the fact that when he does it very much out of a need to redeem himself. Because he has all these enemies in Parliament. The Whigs in that party in Parliament, they hate him because he's this old guard representative of empire. And when they don't like him, they refer to him as the coward of Minden. You know, they dredge up this old wound. So he's fighting the Americans with what he calls Roman severity. You know, he's going to really crack down on them for their insubordination, and he's really doing it in part out of this need to redeem himself. This Brotier-Furro is the name he was born with in West Africa. And this, by the way, is one of the portraits that's not from life. This is, he was probably a member of the Fulani tribe in West Africa. And my sister found a Fulani mask from the 18th century and used that as the basis for the face. And then she put New England farmers' clothing on him. And I gave a talk in Haddam, Connecticut, which is where he eventually settled, and not too long ago, and some of his descendants came to the talk, and one of them brought out gave me a picture of, I think it was her grandfather, and she said, you know, it's a pretty good likeness. So my sister was delighted to hear that. So he was born Brotier-Furro. He says he was the son of a local prince or a village elder. When he was about 10 years old, his village was invaded by an African army. He watched his father be beaten and tortured and killed. He was dragged a couple of 100 miles to the coast to a place called Anamabo, where there was and still is the remains of a slaving fort, where the European ships would come and they would buy slaves. And it happened that the ship that was in the harbor was called the Charming Susanna. It was from Newport, Rhode Island. And they bought 87 slaves, including him. He lucked out in one respect. The slaves were destined to go to Barbados, where they were going to work in the sugar fields, and life there was very nasty and usually very short. But he was young, he was strong, he was smart, and the ship's steward, a man named Robinson Mumford, liked him and asked the captain if he could buy him for himself. And he had what they would do, these slavers, the officers would bring with them goods that they would use then to barter for other goods, or in this case for a human being. What he brought was some calico cloth and some rum. I think it was 4 gallons of rum. And so, and that was called, the goods you brought with you to barter were called your venture. So he gave his venture for the boy, and so because of that, he named the boy Venture. So from then on, he was not Brotier Furrow, he was Venture. The Mumford family, they were slavers, and they they leased an island in Long Island Sound called Fisher's Island from the Winthrop family, who were they were the great family of Connecticut. The two Connecticut governors were from there. And so he ends up taking Venture back there, and he spends his teenage years there as a slave. And we don't think about it, but New York, New England, they had slavery too. And he was raising cattle and sheep, which is a little bit ironic because that's what he did in Africa. And he was, from very early on, this was one of the things that really interests me about him, is he had this notion, first of all, they had slavery where he was from in Africa. And he seems to have developed this idea that in this transaction, there were right and wrong ways to go about it. There were proper ways to be a slave owner and proper ways to be a slave. And so you had a certain responsibility. And he dictated his memoir when he was an old man. He never learned to read and write, which is how that became the basis for my reconstructing his story. And in that, he talks about these kinds of things, about how much this mattered to him. And he talks about how he was repeatedly annoyed by the owners that he had who didn't fulfill their part of the bargain. He was working hard, he was doing what he should do, but they weren't. So he eventually gets to the point where he decides he wants to buy his freedom. He gets a wife and they have children, so he wants to buy them all out of slavery. He is really unusual. He becomes a renowned figure in New England. From Fisher's Island, he then is sold to someone who lives in coastal Connecticut in Stonington. And then he's sold again. And each time his stature grows. First of all, he was a really big man, renowned for feats of strength. But people, he was just a remarkable figure. And so the last time he was to be sold, he actually went around and interviewed different prospective owners to decide who he would go with. And a man named Oliver Smith, who was a prominent businessman in that area, agreed with him that he would buy him and he would let him buy himself and his family out of slavery. So that's what happened. Over the next several years, he worked very hard. He allowed him to work in the winter and in the pre-dawn hours. He fished for eels and he grew crops and sold them and raised enough that and mostly chopped wood, that he bought himself and his family out of slavery. And what's interesting to me is that this is happening while white Americans are hearing about the Stamp Act and the Townsend duties and while this wave of freedom is building among white Americans. We deserve freedom. His whole memoir that he dictates, he never mentions the American Revolution, and he lived right through it, and he carried out his own sort of freedom campaign, his own war of independence, so to speak, while this is going on. There were white Americans who thought that if they got freedom, it would apply to everyone. But of course it didn't. And he seems not to have believed that would be the case. So he just worked on his own, bought his freedom. But then once you do that as a slave, a freed slave was a non-entity at the time. Slavery, everybody understood. It was a recognizable institution. But a freed slave, communities were worried that, among other things, if you were freed and then you became destitute, the community had to take over care of you. They had to pay for you. So communities all up and down in the colonies and in the new country barred freed slaves from settling there. So he had this real problem on his hands. So he went inland from the coast to this town of Haddam in Connecticut. It still is a beautiful rural town. And he dealt with this problem by beginning to buy land. He ended up buying 134 acres, which was more land than a prominent white Connecticut farmer would have. And he slowly became a fixture in the community. He was renowned, and in order to buy land then, you didn't just go to the bank, you had to make deals with people. You had to get loans from people. It was kind of this backcountry loan system in place. So the very act of buying land made you a part of the community because you were winning the trust and knitting yourself into the social fabric. So he then lives his whole life there, and at the end of his life dictates his life story. And his memoir is filled with bitterness because, as I say, whether he's in slavery or whether he's free, he's continually disappointed by other people, and that just seemed to be part of his nature. This one of my 6 people everybody knows, and it's this guy. Anybody have any ideas? Yes, this is George Washington. This is from a painting by Charles Wilson Peale. This is in 1772, so he's 40 years old here. Washington was the last of the 6 people I chose, and I don't know, he's the most obvious, the most famous person from the whole era. So I think because of that, it just didn't occur to me. And then when it did, and I thought about it, suddenly it all seemed to fall into place as far as I was concerned, because Washington is the one who crosses paths with many of these others. And when you're with him, you're in all the familiar arenas of the era of the Revolution, from the French and Indian War right through the Revolution to his presidency. I won't say a lot about him because I assume you know a thing or two. But what really interested me, the way I structured this book is it starts from the birth of the first of these people and ends with the death of the last. And I really wanted, I wanted to see this building, this awareness that this war, this revolution of ideas, and see it, how it affected all these different people, and then see them afterwards. Because if you survive a war, then you're a different person, but you're the same person. And how are you on the other side of it? But in doing that, in constructing it like that, you're also looking at how the child makes the grown adult. And in Washington's case, he's famously enigmatic. People, when other leaders, Jefferson, Adams, whoever, they were all together, they would always comment about how Washington was quiet, he was reserved, he didn't say much, and so he had this mask that he wore. But I kind of felt like I got him. Maybe it's hubris to say that, but one of the great things about doing research nowadays is so much you can do online, and I was able to live every day at my computer with his writings. And when you live month after month with someone, you can get a sense of them. And I think the key to him was the fact that when he was 11 years old, his father died. He was from the minor gentry in Tidewater, Virginia. His father had a lot of ambition, but things were difficult in his time. He was a tobacco farmer, but the prices of tobacco in Europe were down. And yet his father had been able to send his 2 oldest sons to England to be educated, which is what you expected, and that's what Washington expected. But when his father died, his mother was kind of a backwoods woman. She didn't care about the education, apparently. She wanted to keep him close to the farm. She wanted his help. So this really changed his life, but he decided from that point on that he would invent himself as a member of the gentry. And you see him doing that. He got his hands on an etiquette manual when he was 16, and he copied out 111 rules of civility, he called them. These are like how you behave as a gentleman in society, how you walk up and down when you're talking to an important person, just stand a little bit behind them, how you look at them and nod. He would say things, and he wrote down things like, if you're having dinner with important people and you're eating fruit that had a pit in it, like a cherry, don't spit it loudly into your plate, but do it quietly into your hands and things. So you can see this child painstakingly, trying to imprint this on himself. And two words come to mind, old-fashioned words: honor and virtue. Virtue was something inside you. You looked inside yourself and said, am I a trustworthy person? Am I? And if you felt yes, that you were, then the confirmation of that came from outside, and that was honor. If you behaved, if you acted, if you dressed, if you, I mean, he became an expert horse rider and fencer. So if you got back that from the public, this notion that you were honorable, then that connected with your inner sense of virtue. And I think that's what he was doing. He was creating this this sense of himself as a gentleman. And then he does that again. When he's appointed to lead the Continental Army, he was not a general before. He read books, and he invented this persona of a general. And then again, when he becomes first the president, he invents not only himself as president, but he invents the office of president. You can kind of see him doing this and realizing that's what it takes. So Washington, to me, was fascinating because he is so many things that we all recognize, but also there was something to me appealing about putting him alongside five other people who you probably don't know, and some of them who are very minor people in the scheme of things, but giving them all sort of the same amount of attention. Going back to my point about individual freedom and individual worth, and all men are created equal, giving and seeing how they all deal with the same basic struggles of life. Kayetwake, that was his name in the Seneca language. The Americans, the English, called him corn planter. One of the difficulties of writing about the Native Americans is that they did not themselves have a written culture. So right away, you're getting things interpreted. You're getting things from an American perspective, or the English, or the French. With him, it was first of all, there's a lot written about him. There are a lot of sources. One of the sources is actually a native source. His nephew, whose name was Governor Blacksnake, went around with him when he was involved in all of his adventures. And very late in his life, around 1850, he dictated his life story, and therefore Corn Planters, to another Iroquois who wrote it down in kind of pidgin English. And scholars don't refer to this source much, but it really gives you this, it feels like you're getting a much closer read on the person. And so you put that together with newspaper accounts. Benjamin Franklin's newspaper, the Pennsylvania Gazette, wrote about him all the time. And the other thing that struck me about him is we have this sense of the natives as, maybe because we don't have a lot of source material on them, as sort of quiet and noble and it's hard to get complexity or depth. He showed himself in these various to these various people who wrote about him, and he's a complex figure, and you can see that. And one source of his complexity is the fact that his mother was a powerful Seneca woman. The Iroquois, the Six Nations of the Iroquois, are a matrilineal society, so women have a lot of power, and she was a powerful woman. His father was a sort of white ne'er-do-well, a rum trader who came from upstate New York, showed up in the village one day, and then left shortly thereafter. But everybody in the village knew of this guy, and he, as an adult, Corn Planter, talks about how when he was a kid, other boys in the village would make fun of him because his skin color was different. And this, by the way, is from a painting, a famous painting, which is in the New York Historical Society. And if you saw the painting, you could see his skin color. So he has this kind of complexity. He can see different sides of an issue. Nothing is black and white for him. I'll go back to, I was talking about Lord George Germain running the war for England and running it with Roman severity. Then the Battle of Saratoga happens when the British lose an entire army. Nothing like this had ever happened before. His enemies in Parliament are calling him the coward of Minden. What are we going to do? So then he says, all right, I'm pulling out all the stops. We're going to get the Iroquois in on our side. And until then, both the Americans and the British wanted to keep the Iroquois out because they didn't fight the same way. They attacked villages. They were both afraid of them. So now British agents go among the Iroquois. They get them all to meet at Oswego in New York. And there's this vast meeting, and the Iroquois are deciding what to do. And Cornplanter says, he calls the war a family quarrel. And he says, we should stay out of it. We don't understand it. That's not our affair. His opposite, another rising leader, was a Mohawk whose name in English is Joseph Brandt. He was very Anglified. He'd gone to London. He spoke English. He took an English name. And he said, look, I've been to London. I've seen how big and powerful their empire is. They are going to win this. And once they do, they'll leave us alone. They're so far away, you won't believe it. So he convinced the Iroquois that the right thing to do was to side with the British. And Cornplanter lost that, but Cornplanter went along with the majority, and he led Iroquois war parties, vicious battles against the Americans, against villages and against forts. And in the middle of one of these battles, at a place called Fort Plain, New York, where I just spoke last week, they're ready through the smoke. There's burning homes. He sees an old man, and he grabs him and pulls him with the prisoners, and they're marching 10 miles down the road after they've sacked this village. He stops and turns around to this man, because he knew that that's where he lived, that that's where his father was from. And he turned around and said, you don't know who I am. I'm your son. You're my father. And so this happened 2 or 3 times where he tried to connect with this man, and he feels this absence, this abandonment. And he tried, and even then, in the middle of the war, he says, look, we're good to our old people, and we'll come to our village and we'll take care of you, and you can live easy. And his father doesn't want to have anything to do with it. And so he's hurt again. But again, he shows you this. He gives you a sense of who he was as a person. So the war ends, the British lose, which means the Iroquois lose. And then the Iroquois appoint Cornplanter to be their negotiator with the new American government. And he's put in this impossible position, which he never wanted to be in. He never wanted to fight in the first place. And so he goes repeatedly over a period of a number of years, different negotiations, trying to, and again, what's interesting is he's a realist. He knows, he's not some kind of wooden Indian who's going and saying, we want our lands back and we want everything the way it was. He sees what's going on. So he's trying to get something out of these negotiations. And then he returns to his people, and they're angry with him because he didn't get the clock rolled back. And then he goes again. And one time, when he comes to the Americans, he says, will you bring can I bring an armed guard with me? Because there are death threats from my own people on me. So the last 2 times he negotiates, it's with George Washington in Washington's presidency. And the very last time is on the last day of Washington's presidency. And it's this very poignant thing. He says, by this point, Americans are basically forcing the Iroquois to sell lands. And with Washington, he says, he doesn't say, make them stop or anything like that. He says, help me understand this. I have heard that there are things called banks. I've heard that there's something called interest. In the past, we've sold land, and then we spent the money, and we didn't have anything. Will you guarantee me that if we do this, you will help me put the money in a bank, and then we will get interest? And so he's just trying to find some future. He's being very reasonable. And so to me, he really represents, he's kind of a metaphor for the Native Americans as a whole. Abraham Yates, one thing that's underappreciated is the kind of class struggle that was going on during the Revolution. And Yates was a blacksmith's son. He was a shoemaker in Albany, New York, and he really feels this class difference. So he very early on, he declares that they should declare independence from England. He doesn't like the high-blown aristocrats from overseas telling them what to do. He is on a number of committees in New York State during the war. He's communicating with Washington and others. He's one of the writers of New York State's Constitution. He taught himself the law while all this is going on. So he becomes this very fiery leader at the street level and staying local, staying in his town in Albany. Then the war ends, and he basically turns on the American leaders, on Jefferson and Adams and Hamilton and the others, because he sees them creating a new elite to replace the foreign elite, and in a way that was what was happening. He was a believer in the Articles of Confederation, the first document that gave the states all the power. Most people felt that wasn't working. They weren't able to raise an army or raise taxes. So it was farmers and tradesmen, people like him, who were opposed to this Constitution that came into being. He was vehemently opposed to it. When he saw the first draft of the Constitution, he was enraged by the first three words, "We the people," because he knew that it was a group of elite leaders meeting secretly, and now they dare to say that they represent all the people. He didn't like, in particular, the way the office of the president was drawn up in the Constitution. He said, all a president has to do is cajole enough of the Senate into backing him, and then he can stack the Supreme Court with his people and become a tyrant. So he becomes, I'll pause for that. So Yates becomes a forerunner of American populism. And populism, throughout American history, sometimes it's on the left, sometimes it's on the right. In the past couple of years, it was very strongly on the right, and now it's very strongly shifted on the left. Like, we're afraid of Washington, we're afraid of the power of the president or the federal government. So he really is a forerunner of a lot of things. I want to allow some time for questions, so I'm going to hurry through the last two here. Margaret Moncrief was a teenage daughter of a British officer when the war broke out. She was living in Manhattan, and the first big battle, and really the biggest battle of the war, was the battle for New York. There was a moment where her father was with the British, who were gathering, the British Army was gathering on Staten Island, preparing to invade New York, and the Washington and the Continental Army were on Manhattan and in Brooklyn, trying to figure out how to defend it. And she was caught behind enemy lines. She considered herself a loyalist because her father was British. So she's trapped with the American officers at that time. She falls in love with one named Aaron Burr. She has run-ins with Washington because she acts like, she lets him know that she supports the king and not this upstart American movement. One reason I really wanted to focus on her was going all the way back to what I said at the beginning about this wave of freedom. How did that relate to women? Because through this period, and really starting in the decades thereafter, you'd begin to see a women's movement. The cutting edge of it in her time was forced marriage. People were saying, and people were writing in newspapers and writing plays about, with the idea that a girl should not be forced to marry against her will. And that's what happened to her. In the middle of all this, her father decides she will marry another British officer, a man she hated. He was abusive. He introduced her to prostitutes. She was like, no, I won't marry this. Her father forced her. They got married in Trinity Church in Manhattan, and she was incredibly feisty. She wrote a memoir that the voice just jumps up at you in her memoir. She describes then when this husband of hers takes her back to England, back to Europe, they fight the whole way on the ship. It's so much that the captain has to warn her husband to be decent to her, or he's going to have to imprison him. They get to an inn in Wales as their first stop. He's checking them in. She walks out the back door of the inn, walks into the Welsh wasteland for 60 miles, never sees him again. She does things like this repeatedly. She's just this figure who's just, you couldn't make up. She, at one point, fakes her own death. She decides that she wants to become this. There's this moment. This is this moment when there is this notion of independence for women, and she wants to have it. it was really too soon for that. So her life really became a tragedy. But she decided that there are two ways to go about it. You could become a mistress or you could become an actress. She tried both. She had better luck being a mistress. So for a while, she's at masked balls, which is why my sister put a mask on her. She's at masked balls in London and then in Paris on the arms of a general or a duke or an earl. And then later, she's in debtor's prison because she's built up this opulent lifestyle, and then she's ruined, and then it happens all over again, and then she just disappears. We don't know how she died. So to me, she represents, her life ends up very far away from what we think of as the theater for the American Revolution, but it really gets back to what I started with, this notion of individual freedom, and freedom being this thing that starts in the 1600s. The American Revolution is one part of it, and all of American history, through the civil rights movement, the women's movement, it has been an attempt to play out that unfolding of individual freedom, and we are struggling with it even today. I'll leave it at that. Thank you all very much.
Oh, sure.
My publisher told me. And I didn't ask anybody's permission.
Test. Oh, there we go. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Russell. Yeah, it was great, right? It was great. Before we get to your questions, a few reminders. Number one, Russell Shorto's books are available for sale from Beaverdale Books. This is the hardback. The paperback comes out in November, and he will autograph them for you after the program this evening. On your way out, please grab some refreshments provided by the foundation and stay a while to commune with your fellow book lovers, your fellow history, I want to say nerds, but that feels negative. Lovers. The parking lot across the street at 10th and Grand closes at 10 p.m. Thank you to Principal for letting the foundation use this lot. The garage below the library won't close until after the last book is autographed. So you don't have to hurry. We promise we will not lock you in. So, Russell, while people are writing their questions down on their white pieces of paper, please do. You actually, I love that we ended with her, because you actually found some documents of hers that revealed new history. Is that too dramatic to say?
No, I think that's fair.
Can you hear me?
I was doing something wrong. I alluded to before, she faked her own death. Very few people have written about her, but those who have assume that she died in 1787 because there are obituaries for her, which is a good reason to assume that. But I just knew that was wrong, because I knew that she was, first of all, she had several times in her life, she does these dramatic exits. And her memoir is published in 1794, and it shows her life right up to 1794. So it's like, well, so then these people, other historians who wrote about her said, well, someone else decided to publish her memoir, and they invented these stories up to that period. But it doesn't make any sense. Imagine somebody writing a life now and then inventing events, and then she names names, so all these other people would say, wait a second, that never happened. So it was wrong. But I suspected that she had faked her death, and that she had done it, and it basically says why in the memoir, that she had all these debts mounting, and creditors were coming, they were going to throw her in prison, and she does this, and then flees to France, and then ends up carrying on a whole life there. But I needed documentation, and I ended up that she wrote from after that period, the last one in 1805, so I got her.
What do you do after you reveal new history? Like, do you take a shot? Like, do you go for
a shot of whiskey?
Yes. It's got to be exciting.
It's a very exhilarating thing when you know that. And some of these people, this one woman at Indiana University who's written about her, I was telling her, I think this is right. And then when I was at New York Historical Society and I found the first document, and the first thing I did was write to her, because she's like the only person in the world who's going to get this. There's this very small community, but it's a very exciting thing.
One questioner wants to know, how did you keep and organize all this information straight? Note cards, computer notes, how'd you keep it straight?
Yeah, I'm not very, I'm systematic, but I have many different systems going on at once, so it's kind of a mess. A lot of it is on the computer. There are times when I'll just have sort of index cards taped all down the side of the bookshelf, and I had these piles, these 6 piles, one for each of them. And I decided I wanted to make this chronological, and I wanted to be able to weave back and forth through their stories, so we're following all of them, and it's not perfectly clear cut, because this one I'm taking them through an episode that ends in June of 1760. Then we have to back up a year to get to the next one's life, and then that carries forward into the next year, let's say. So just figuring out all of that was a puzzle, and I think I did it one step at a time. So I didn't have a master plan, or a very loose one.
How would you describe the difference between historical fiction and the genre of Revolution song?
Well, historical fiction, you make things up. And this doesn't make things up. But there's an important thing to understand about writing history, nonfiction history, narrative history. You're not making things up, but you are interpreting. There's a lot we don't know. And so there are ways, you just signal to the reader, it may have happened. The best theory for what happened next is this. So you're letting people know, we don't exactly know this, but we think it's probable. And that's, I think, an important function of someone who's writing history. There are some historians who only, who don't want to interpret, and they're giving you laundry lists of their research. And I think, for the most part, if someone is reading history, they're basically saying, look, you've spent years with this. I want your interpretation. I want you to tell me what you think. So I think that's part of my job. But it's not fiction. Fiction is really, you're winging it.
How did your writing Revolution song change your thinking or your opinions on the Revolutionary War in that time frame?
There's so many ways. I'm just trying to pick one, but this can apply to any period, but particularly, it's very hard to look at the past, and I think especially that period in time, and really realize that for the people who were in the middle of it, they had no idea what would happen. Just like now, we don't know with North Korea, China, Russia, what's going on in the U.S., we don't know what's going to happen next year. And we're all like, oh my God. That's how they were. They really had no idea. And one really amazing thing that jumped out of, when I was talking about reading Washington's letters, in the middle of the war, he's leading the Continental Army, and he's writing to, I can't remember if it was his cousin, I can't remember who he was writing to, someone in his family. And he mentions that he had a plan in case this all collapsed. He owned miles and miles of wilderness near where I live, Maryland, Panhandle, Pennsylvania, Ohio. He was going to flee into that land and escape, because he would be the one they would come after. So he had no idea what would happen. That really makes you feel that history is just, we're living it right now, and that we don't know what happens is a really visceral thing with them.
I asked you this question too when we spoke, but someone would like to know one or two of the people who, got final callbacks but didn't make the cast list.
Yeah, there's so many great people from the period, and some of them, for example, Molly Brandt was the sister of Joseph Brandt, the Mohawk leader that I was referring to. A fascinating woman. She's a Native American woman who was a real power broker between the British and the Iroquois. And we know a good deal about her for certain periods of her life, but a lot of her life we know nothing. And the way I conceived of this book, I wanted to be able to tell each story from beginning to end. And so she's an example. And there were many people who, I love this person and I love this, but we only know a bit about them, or we know a lot about just one part of their life. Another who I was really interested, well, I'll tell you, I figured from the beginning I would have one founding father figure, and when this will show you how long ago I started this project. I originally thought it might be Hamilton, because I was thinking he doesn't get enough attention.
We talked about that too. And Hamilton will be here in Des Moines in about 2 weeks. And have you thought about how that show, 8 years ago is about when you started this book. 8 years ago is about when this little idea started percolating. Have you thought about how that affects your book or readers reading your book or the selling of the book in any way?
No. No, I don't, how people come, it's a mystery to me. People come to books via word of mouth or because something sparked their interest in it. And, I'm endlessly fascinated with that process, how you write a book and it's this whole little bundle of ideas and it's this baby that you send out into the world, and watching how it floats around and who it affects and why they pick it up. And if Hamilton sells some copies of my book, that's wonderful, but I don't think in particular about that.
This is sort of a little bit off the specific book topic, but how do you address academic historians who dismiss the educational value of historical novelists like Studs Terkel or others?
Yeah, that's a little tricky to say because, I love historical fiction, but I don't read it for history exactly. I read it for the feeling of history. But I don't read it thinking, oh, now I know this fact and that fact, because I don't know that those are facts. I think it was, what's the guy who wrote The Known World? About a black slave owner. Anyway, he very pointedly told reviewers, I just make it all up. I don't feel that I need to create this this erudite, historically accurate background, and then I let my characters dance around in it. If it seems right to me and I can convince you of it, that's what I do. And I can see that, I can respect that. So I don't read historical novels for specific history, but I do read it for the feeling,
Someone else wants to know sort of about your writer life. When do you write? How do you write? That kind of thing.
Kind of 9 to 5. Long ago I used to write, late at night, but then I had kids, and that changed. And I have an office in my home, but I actually I have different stations. Once everybody's off to school or work or wherever they're going, then I kind of have the place to myself, and so I have different stations. I'll start in the living room for an hour or two, and if it's nice, I'll go out. I'll be out on the front porch on the swing, and then I'll go out in the back, and then so I move around to different stations at different parts of the day, and I have it differs too, obviously, when you're in mainly research mode or in writing mode.
Was anybody else at the Amor Tolles AViD discussion? He had what I felt as though this amazing, where he wakes up in the morning and has coffee and then writes, and then he goes to a cafe that he loves. So it sounds like yours is a little bit more historian-esque.
Yeah, well, when I lived in New York City, I did do that because you live in a really small apartment, and I would go to the cafe, but that was another lifetime ago.
We talked about this as well, but do you envision a sequel set possibly during the Civil War?
I did think of that. I have, I think, 4 or 5 other book ideas, none of which are that right now, that are kind of crowding in around me. But I did think, you could do something similar for the next 100 years of American history and because this really covers, I'm saying it's about the American Revolution. It's about from 1716 to about 1830. And right in the middle of it is the revolution. You could do something similar for the next 100 years and have the Civil War right at the center of it, and pick people from different backgrounds and different walks of life and see how this affects them.
So I asked you this too, and I'm wondering if you've thought any more about it, but if we did it today, like present as past, and put it together, who do you think you would include?
Well, I guess you would want to look at the newspaper headlines and find someone that represents different. I mean, I did that in a way. I tried to find representative types, but I didn't want to be scientific either. And I think I wanted to, as I said, there was serendipity. I just have to have this person. And so there would be that. But, you would have some people who represent sort of digital internet wealth, and you'd have somebody who's a coal miner, for example. I mean, you have people who represent, in a way, different ways that the country seems to be pulled right now.
So I have been thinking about it, and can I offer you? Yeah. Can I offer you the person who I think ties it all together?
Okay.
Oprah. I think I really.
Are you good? Okay, now I'm going to ask you. So, what? How does Oprah tie it all together?
I think, I always joke that there are two things I miss every day: cigarettes and the Oprah show, because I really loved the Oprah show. And she was someone who, much like Washington, but totally different, also, she had historical figures, presidents, starters of companies, celebrities, and then had these sort of normal people on her show. And so I think in the same way that Washington was kind of the touch point throughout, I think she could be.
Sure. So she has a life that touches a lot of these aspects, fame and the media and African American experience.
Sure,
yeah.
Sure. Yeah. There, you call me when you're ready to write it. And to that point, Washington seemed essential to tying your characters together, and I think you've said that. But this questioner says you didn't seem to like him as much as the others. I don't know if you mean from reading the book or the way I presented him here. I tried to present him warts and all. With all of them, I tried to present them the way I interact with them, and that's. I think that's important. When I was talking about interpretation, you're getting it mediated through, that's what you come to a book for, which is why, in a funny way, I'm always a little leery of books that are written by two authors, because I want one person's take on whatever it is. I'm not going to necessarily say that's the gospel truth about that, but that's important to have it mediated. And so I'm mediating, and I'm giving my best shot at how I feel about these people and who they are. And in Washington's case, I mean, there's a lot of warts. You see him as a real person when you're really digging into the material. To me, that makes him very compelling. It makes him very human. And when he's, after all this, he's exhausted, and they kind of you're the only one who can be president. And he really doesn't seem to want to do it. And then he sits down. One of the first things he does is he writes a letter to Adams, his vice president. Says, "Dear Mr. Vice President, I wonder if you could help me. I'm trying to figure out basically how do I be president." And it's just this very human thing that after all this, he doesn't have the experience behind him. I mean, he does more than anyone else, but he's making it up. And so the idea of inventing your life and reinventing your life is a very American thing, and that to me is what he did over and over. So in that sense, I really kind of bonded with him, I guess. So you did like him as much as the others?
Like is a funny word. I mean, I like them all. I love them all, but it's like they're like your kids, they drive you crazy,
We have, these are really good questions. I'm super impressed with all you guys. We're not going to get to all of them, but just a few more. The roots of American democracy are usually attributed to the French. Were the Dutch shortchanged?
Going back to my other...
your other hat.
The thesis of my book, The Island at the Center of the World, about the Dutch founding of New York, is essentially that the Dutch in Europe, and this goes to my book, Amsterdam, What Made the Dutch Dutch, because of their battles with water, they developed two things. They developed tolerance, especially over religious differences, and a unique approach to trade. So tolerance and free trade are what they brought, and those are the things that really, I mean, that's ingredients for New York City. And that's what distinguished New York City, first as New Amsterdam and then as New York. And then because New York had the influence it did, it diffused and those things became features of American culture at large. So that when in the 19th century, when great waves of immigrants came, they came for the most part into Manhattan, and they looked around at what was then this teeming society with millions of people speaking different languages and worshiping different faiths and struggling to get ahead with what we would call upward mobility. And this was all very new, and this had come because it was once New Amsterdam. But when these newcomers came in the 19th century, they said, this is America. And they moved westward. They moved to Iowa. They moved to California with this notion in mind. So in that way, I mean, it's a very diffuse way. It's hard to pinpoint things. But in that way, they had this enormous influence.
So tell us a little bit about what's next. What can we expect upcoming from you?
I am writing a book that is history, but it's quite different. It's I'm from Johnstown, Pennsylvania, which is a steel town. It was if you know of it, you probably know the Johnstown flood. Steel town in western Pennsylvania that was really booming in the mid-20th century, and it's now the poorest city in Pennsylvania. And my grandfather and his brother-in-law ran the mafia there. I kind of grew up, you know how there's things in your family that nobody talks about, but you somehow as a kid know, and it'll be things like, you'll catch some look between the adults, and you're able to process all this stuff. So then it occurred to me later, eventually I thought, well, that's a story because it's not the typical mafia story, it's a small town story. But, my grandfather's gone, they didn't keep notebooks, these guys, So I thought, well, I can't, I can't get it. But so then what happened was I was back home, I was living in Amsterdam at the time, visiting over Christmas. This is my father's father I'm talking about. My mother's cousin had worked for him as a numbers runner. Then he was a jazz musician. He left home, went to Las Vegas, had his whole career there, playing stand-up bass and singing "Fly Me to the Moon" and things. And so then he had retired and moved back home. And this was a Christmas time, and we said, "Oh, let's go down to this club and see Frankie play." So we did, and a lot of family members are there. And in the break, Frank said to me, "Russ, you're a writer. What are we going to do about the stories?" And I said, "What stories?" And he said, "Your grandfather, the mob." And everyone, all of my other family members, because they had internalized this "we don't talk about it" thing, they all kind of did this. But he had left so long before that to him these were golden memories, So I thought, okay. Then I contacted him and said, "Frank, I'm going to come back for a week and see if there's anything there." And so I came back just for that, and he wanted to meet at Panera Bread, which is his hangout, and I turned on the tape recorder, and he started talking, and then some little old Italian guy came, and then another, and there were like 8 or 10 guys. He had called out put out the word, and 4 hours later, I turned off the tape recorder and said, "Okay, this is the basis of something," So there were lots of stories put together with, trips to the county courthouse and my grandfather's arrest records and the police department. So it's a small town mob story, and it's also me looking. His name was originally Rosario Shorto, and then it was Americanized to Russell Shorto. So I was named after him. So it's me looking for my grandfather.
I'm so excited about that one. That one's great. If I didn't get to your questions, please ask them. These were all really, really good questions, so please ask them. Thank you to Russell Shorto for coming to Des Moines. Thank you to you guys for supporting the library. This is the last AViD of the season. If you'd like to recommend authors for next year, please fill out those handy blue foundation cards. Don't forget to sign up for the summer reading program, and don't forget to visit the library. This is an amazing thing we have in our city. Please patronize it. Thank you again, Russell.